obvious suit.
Beautiful people, I am Oliver Perrin, and thank you for joining me at A Safer Space. I am joined today by Mr. Tim Rudisil from East Tennessee, and we're going to pick up on a conversation that we left off on. The first part of all of this was commies among us, communists in the United States, but in order to discuss that, we had to talk a bit about communists everywhere else. This clip is supposed to be about communists everywhere else. But I think in reality, we're going to have to bounce back between the United States and the rest of the countries around the world. So perhaps we won't have a perfect division of these two topics, but you can consider this an extension of the previous one, a part two, if you will. And we will dive into it in just a moment. Before we do so, I want to remind you to subscribe at A Safer Space, to stay subscribed at Semiagog so that you have the ability to follow the content. There are analogs of both these channels over on BitChute, and there's Gab, Minds, and Patreon. So check all those things out. And without further ado, I will turn this over to Mr. Rudisil, who can discuss with us communists further afield than just in the United States. I'm hoping that you'll be able to help us to try to ferret out, or at least give us the tools we could ourselves use to ferret out divisions between these groups, how they can be subdivided. For example, are the Maoists doing something different than the post-Soviet Russians? Are these two groups related to or distinct from folks like Soros? Who's doing what? How do they interrelate? And what can we see there? What can we dig up to help better understand the manipulations and activities of communists and socialists around the world?
Well, the first thing I would say to you is that you've got the Russians, who are next to nothing, really, were it not for their nuclear weapons. Basically, they're a large country with a small population. Then you've got China, a large country with a large population. Then you've got Venezuela, which should be the richest country in the fucking world. Should be putting Saudi Arabia to shame.
And now it's down at the bottom of the heap. The only country doing slightly better that is not as bad as Venezuela is Turkey. But now Turkey has fallen to the point where it's almost as bad as Venezuela, yes.
Well, there you are, you see. Now, the thing is that you've got the EU, which is basically a socialist gathering that wants to welcome all the refugees and make everything wonderful and fine and marvelous and socialistic, and pay everybody's bills. But you see, there's one problem. The Chinese communists have started an offensive that we in the West are doing nothing about. I have dealt with it several times on here. It's the One Belt, One Road offensive. Now, the One Belt, One Road, the old Silk Road thing, that's partially an offensive.
The string of pearls, that's part of that, yes.
Partially an offensive. And then there's Africa. And Africa is the real, true offensive.
And there's quite a bit in Central America. You know how I discovered that they had dumped all this money? It's on hold currently, but they wanted to cut a parallel to the Panama Canal in Nicaragua and, things they're doing in Latin America.
Sure. That's nothing compared to what they're doing in Africa. Africa's got countries over there that are the size of huge countries like the Belgian Congo, not Belgian Congo, what is it called? Central African Republic.
Or Democratic Republic of the Congo or whatever. Angola, big ass countries.
Yes. And the Chinese are building railroads in them, loaning huge amounts of money and building railroads. Now, the thing is that no one seems to understand that the Chinese are building railroads, but they're not teaching these people new skills. See, if you look at the high-speed rail lines the Chinese are putting in their own country and the high-speed rail lines they're putting in the African nations, you very quickly spot that they're putting down ties, not wood ties, concrete ties, but they're putting them down out there on the rail bed. And then they're coming back with the rails.
Yeah, so it's the same kind of.
That's in China. Because you've got to have people who can tighten them down properly.
Right, but in Africa, as you pointed out, they're dropping down the whole segment pre-assembled. So these people are.
And it was pre-assembled where?
In China. And
no, in the factory there, in Africa, by Chinese workers. So you've got two basic sets of workers there. You've got the Chinese who are actually doing the fucking work. Then you've got the Africans who go around pounding in concrete and...
the equivalent of breaking rocks, yeah.
Basically, yes. Making little ones out of big ones. And yet, the Chinese tout this as though they are putting all these Africans to work.
And
they're not.
We have many times discussed, the geopolitical strategy involved with China in Africa and how that relates to China.
But has anyone bothered to look at the number of African nations that China is currently involved with?
Yeah, well, we've got South Africa, we've got Zimbabwe, don't we? We've got Angola.
Kenya, Chad.
Yeah, Sudan as well.
Angola, Nigeria, Ethiopia. Oh, damn it, man! It seems as though they're running rampant all across Africa.
Yes. Let me get this part out that I was trying to. It's that we've looked at, and this may be where you're going already, in which case I'm doing what I usually do, which is to introduce what you were already trying to say. But we've got a situation where we know about the geopolitical strategy of much of what they're doing. We know how it sends resources home. It allows them to lend money, to manipulate, all kinds of things. And how then that balances against other things like the United States, in theory, or competes with other groups, in theory. And again, perhaps this is where you're already going. What I'm wondering is, what is it that they intend to do to Africa other than exploit it for its resources? What would be left behind as a result of their activities there in terms of reshaping the region?
Are lots of African males headed to Europe now? Well, that leaves lots of African females there by themselves, doesn't it?
While you're importing Chinese males.
Oh, damn it. Well, there is that, is there not?
There is.
Well.
Is anyone competing with them in Africa? Again, we're looking at this globally, and we're trying to figure out who these other power groups are, even competing socialists and commies.
Who's paying for all these Africans to go across the Mediterranean?
European NGOs, and there are a number of European groups.
European NGOs
are doing it in part, at least once they get up to the northern coast. Libya, Tunisia, and the rest.
What about when they're coming from Unji-Bunjiville in lower Nigeria?
I don't know, but I would have to guess it's probably backed by the Chinese as well as other countries' intelligence services. But I know that, again, Europeans are in large part involved with investments, like the Italians working on some dams there.
They're working on dams because the African nations are getting the funding, one wonders from whom, to put all this together. I wonder where they're getting the money from, do you think, Ollie? Odd that, is it not?
China would be an obvious guess.
You think? Well, that seems the Chinese are busy little beavers, are they not? One wonders how they're going to string all these railroads together, as well as that great dam project. And then one wonders, in light of all Chinese people being declared to be African.
Oh yeah, and in South Africa for what was it? Black economic empowerment for purposes of the South Africans and the whether or not the Chinese are eligible for receiving the benefits of black economic empowerment. Yes, the Chinese have been dubbed blacks.
My goodness, my gracious. Makes you wonder who's going to be farming what where, eh? Well, Chinese make very good masters, I understand. They used to import lots of black slaves. The only thing was they castrated them before they took them in.
Much like Muslims.
Yes, they did. Ah, well.
Yeah, we didn't have eunuchs so much unless we wanted to create a castrato to sing. Otherwise, the Chinese and the Muslims were big on eunuchs.
Yes, we left them with their dangly bits dangling out there, did we not? Bad mistake on our part, it would seem, eh?
Yeah, it was horribly evil whiteys. But what do the rest of the communists think about this? We know that from previous discussions you've had that it seems likely that the Russians are willing to wait it out because they can see how it's going to create an opportunity.
The Russians have got Iran, Syria, and Turkey to deal with. They've got lots on their plate right now, not pushing out so much as they're pushing down.
And they don't need the territory as much. They've got their own.
Don't
that they
need the territory
at
all. Yes.
So they've got their
and they haven't a surplus
issues.
Population either.
Now, would you see the Russian communists, whether they're called that or not, would you see them as a distinct group from both the Chinese and the Internationale?
Oh, yes.
And so what of our Internationale? What are they up to? And where does the European Union's commies fit into this picture?
Ah, well, now you come close to tying.
Sorry, I shouldn't have said where do the European commies fit into this picture?
Well, you came very close to tying two of them together. They deserve to be tied together, the Communist Internationale and the EU.
So the EU is probably the vehicle for the current activities of the Internationale.
One group of activities for the Internationale, yes.
And so Soros would seem to fall into
so is China. Soros and China, very close together, and the EU and China and Soros are very close together.
But you would not say that the Chinese are simply a vehicle of the Internationale.
No, not simply a vehicle of it.
So it's an overlapping Venn diagram in a number of ways.
I'm not sure I really care to go into that. But I will say this, and mean it wholeheartedly, that what we have here is a basic failure to notice what the fuck is going on. Because over here, it's all about Russia. Whereas Ms. Feinstein has just been castigated by someone for having a Chinese agent as her chief operating officer in California, in San Francisco, who also drove her, who worked for her for 20 to 25 years.
Now, what do you mean by chief operating officer? Because he was a driver, and I've seen from my own exposure to people with a little bit of money what a driver actually does. They're like a gentleman's gentleman. They take care of all your shit. He did a good bit
more than just drive, and he did a good bit more than just take care of shit.
And he did, as I've seen from some of the news reports, he was involved in actually meeting with Chinese diplomats and business people who came to California to do their thing.
Also apparently ran the San Francisco office for her. The old boy was very much in the know as far as Miss Feinstein was concerned.
Well, maybe this is a good point to dart in. We were thinking about doing this as a separate clip, but
well, there'll be enough of it for that.
but the idea that there's a very big difference between a minder and a spy. All spies, excuse me, all minders are spies, but not all spies are minders. And it seems that with
Isn't that the truth?
Feinstein,
Yes.
what we had here was a minder.
Well, yes, we did. A minder who may have known enough about her to make her go along with him and what he saw and what he wanted, which is to say, what his bosses wanted. The real thing with all of this, Ollie, is that no matter how you look upon it, Feinstein is corrupted. Not just compromised, but corrupted. She is a senator in charge of one of the most powerful committees in the Senate.
Yeah, and the largest state in the union, and one that it's certainly economically the largest. I can't remember if in territory it's bigger or smaller than Alaska, but California has an economy that's larger than most nations.
Yes, it is. But by the same token, Miss Feinstein was not just compromised, but corrupted. If you're compromised, you're still at liberty to tell me to fuck off, and all I can do is expose you. Whereas if you're corrupted, you're in there with me, starting, no matter where you may have started, starting to see how my plans can be furthered because you are now corrupted. Your interest and mine have become inseparable. So many of these people love to run around and holler about Russia as though Russia were the great enemy of America. It is not. Makes you wonder how many of them have Chinese drivers, as it were. Makes you wonder how many of them have taken money from China, lots of money from China, either to themselves or to their relatives.
So it would seem that, and you would expect this in any case, that what's happening, at least in part, is that China is attempting to sort of make all the other competing communist groups its own.
No. China does not want the other competing communist groups as its own. It wants to use them. That is all. You've got to remember, China has a lot of what we would call small businesses, that is to say, banks and such like, that are theoretically owned by the state, but are actually owned by warlords. Those who have managed to live through the purges and so on in China and solidified their power in China. This is why the Chinese banks are so interested in putting out billions of yuan. You know that toilet paper that they espouse the use of? It makes one wonder about the toilet paper and what's going to be done with it, because there's going to be so much of it out there that it's going to have to be dealt with in some fashion. Some fashion. Trump is getting ready to deal with it in one fashion, getting ready to say, I don't need to shit that much. I don't need this much toilet paper. And it's probably going to work because he keeps raising the tariffs. He keeps raising the number of them. He keeps raising the amount of them.
And as you discussed in our previous clip, called China the Paper Tiger, they're a paper tiger. That shit is a Potemkin village from top to bottom, ready to collapse.
Yes, it is. All it's got to do is somebody's got to go, well, wands are nice, but I'd like some dollars. And it goes, oops, this is why they've been buying all the gold they can get, they in India. And yet the price of gold is down. Why is that, do you suppose? How does the price of a commodity that everybody wants, how does it fall?
It's
Because
beyond,
it's falling.
it's beyond my knowledge base.
Ah,
But you did pay attention to gold for a time, leaving aside other ways in which you did so in other contexts. You ran a pawn shop for a while, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
So you had to deal with gold and silver coins and precious metals and pay attention to what was going on with that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. And I would suggest to anybody who wants to know about the price of gold that they take a look at the price of gold and what it's done in the past few weeks and what it seems to be trying to do. Because it reached up to almost 1,300 an ounce. And then it started falling and falling and falling to where it's now almost 1,200 an ounce. Makes one wonder, does it not? Because one buys gold as a hedge against inflation and currency depreciation. I guess we must not be about to inflate or have a currency be destroyed, must we?
Or maybe we're trying to, move under cover of darkness and light more campfires and all the rest, and it's about to come down hard. But now, one question I would have is, can you help me understand India and why it's doing the same thing? Now, I know that they're close to each other. They're tied to each other in certain ways, and they're competitors in certain ways very directly, China and India. I know also that it's simply a part of Indian culture, that is where not just the government, but the populations go in order to create the hedges for themselves, portable wealth, jewelry on their women if they have to flee, et cetera, et cetera. But we also saw, as came up in our discussions a year or so ago, that Modi was trying to empty out the Brahmins' temple cellars in order to get more gold out there into circulation. Now I figured, and it turned out to be the case, Modi or not, ruler or not, that, you can have better luck trying to squeeze blood from a stone than get the Brahmins to turn loose the gold they have in the bottom of the temples. But
Certainly.
But the question remains, why is it that India specifically is doing this as well? Why do we not see the equivalent thing in Europe?
You must remember, India is a confederacy. It's not one nation. It's a confederacy. Now, that ought to explain the totality of it to you. Modi is trying to weld them together. What's happening when he's trying to weld them together? They're popping at the seams, aren't they?
Right. You have problems in the south with Tamil groups. You have issues with, communists in Nagaland.
Not to mention Kashmir.
Right. Or the economic divisions where they're trying to put pressure on Mumbai, to do more when they're already doing most of it.
The state of Assam is most pacifistic at this point, is it not? Isn't it? Isn't it?
So what is the short answer? Because I still don't clearly understand it. They're trying to hedge their bets within the country for potential breakdown?
If they're not careful, they're going to force everybody into revolution in India.
At which point gold becomes the standard.
Well, gold becomes the standard, but Modi becomes the unclean. And everything he's stood for becomes nada, nothing. It's kind of like watching the Mexicans and watching their political situation and understanding that really what you're watching are the machinations and the dancing around of the Hijo Hidalgo group. If you really want to know what's going on in Mexico, you've got to look at the narcotistas. And for the narcotistas, you've got to look to, my God, the communist Chinese, who are exporting to them huge amounts of fentanyl. No, Ollie. We are looking at a situation in which the Chinese communists are stirring the pot in India. That's all they're doing. They're stirring the pot to keep India so that it can't do anything.
Yeah, focus is inwards, trying to keep it together.
Mm-hmm. Because China is running along north of India, is it not? One belt, one road, here we
Trying to march
go.
straight around it, yeah.
India doesn't
Although,
like that very much,
yes,
does it?
and the Chinese will be perfectly happy to sell things to them once they get it in place. But yeah, otherwise they should take a back seat over there.
Yes. Be quiet, little brown person. Yes, it's lovely, is it not? Of course, they're going to make a good inroad into Pakistan, I believe it is.
And we'll see. Yeah, they just had an election there. They got that cricket player in again.
That's all
If I've
right.
been following correctly. So, and then how does this, from a global perspective, bear on what's happening in the U.S.? Is Trump another creature of communists, or can we imagine that there are now players on the board who are against communism? Or are we doomed to socialism no matter what, at a minimum?
No, we're not doomed to socialism no matter what. Yes, there are players on the board who are capitalists. They're trying to bring capitalism as it's supposed to be into the picture.
Not this socialized hybrid that we've been suffering under since at least FDR, but I believe that started even earlier with people like Wilson.
Oh, Wilson was an idealist. He wasn't really to blame. He was, after all, a college professor. The problem is that real live capitalism has never been tried. Never been tried. Not in this country, not in England, not anywhere. Real live capitalism, the capitalist treats his workers as a farmer treats his cattle, especially if he's operating a dairy farm.
Well, it is certainly no accident that capital, cattle, and chattel all come from the same root and the idea of headcount.
This is one of the things that everybody got so excited about with Gaius Julius Caesar. When he made the Capita Censae into the largest group in the Roman army. He was out of legions. Marius was out of legions.
Sulla dealt with the same problems, yeah. So by the time it
Yeah.
got to Caesar, there were real issues. So they had to bring him in. And as I recall, that was directly related to the expansion of Roman citizenship further across the Italian peninsula with some of the allied states, correct?
Well, yes, it was. But Gaius Julius Caesar did something nobody had ever done. He had Rome buy and distribute all of the gear that a soldier needed.
Which previously they had to bring with them, or had to be, if you sent your required number of troops from an allied city-state, the city-state had to cover the expense.
Yes, but that was a different class of person than the soldier citizen of Rome. Yes, different class of citizen entirely. He could be beaten. He could be done with. He was not a Roman citizen. But you see, the thing is that Gaius Julius Caesar dealt with the Capita Censae, the head count. All those people in Rome who were citizens, but they didn't have anything. They had nothing. They didn't even own a slave, not one slave.
Right, the kind of people that he had grown up around in his mother's boarding house. Or apartments and things, I should say.
Well, I think his mother's apartments were a bit upscale for most of that. But be that as it may, they were like trailer park trash.
but Roman citizens nevertheless, once living in the city, the lower class ones.
Ah. And so he took them in and gave them something from Rome. So they now had something. They had a piece of flesh in the race, piece of flesh in the fight.
Right, and if they did their 20 years, they'd get their,
Ah.
portion of land and be able to settle it. It might be out in what's now Romania or whatever to defend the frontiers, but they would end up with something.
Yes, they would. And at the same time, you have this same sort of thing that Trump is trying to do with Americans. Have you noticed how he keeps talking about the black and Hispanic unemployment rates? That's not just to garner the endorsements of black and Hispanics. That's to show them that he's given them a dog in the fight.
Yes, and by the same time to remove them from those who would otherwise be on the welfare rolls on the other side of the fight.
You suppose he's going to bring in health care to make that work out better?
I think he is going to do something with healthcare other than simply opening up the market to be across state lines. The question is when and what form it will take, and I have no idea.
Probably with the next election, his 2020 election. That will have given enough time for Obamacare to have withered and died.
And for him to negotiate behind the scenes with everyone who has a dog in the race for whatever the new form is. It looks like
including those people who are pharmaceuticalists.
Yes, I was just about to say he's sorted some things out recently with Pfizer and others who had raised drug prices, and they had some behind the scenes talking, and they came down again. So it looks like he'll be able to get them under control.
Oh my goodness! You know that terrifies me so much, Ollie, that I'm going to have a snus on that note. Yes. Well, I'm assuming I'm going to have a snus on that note.
What, are you out of them? You've looked down.
No,
and
I have them.
No snuff
I
left?
have the snus. I just don't have the quarter I usually use to. There it is. That I usually use to open them with. You see, snus comes in a tin, and as it comes in a tin, it has to be opened. Yeah. But at any rate, the thing is that. Oh goodness, there we are. The thing is that no matter how you want to look at it, Mr. Trump is taking some people who have nothing and is giving them something for it. And he's giving it to them in the way that Gaius Julius Caesar gave the head count something. Because basically what he did was to enfranchise these people. Trump is wanting to enfranchise everybody who's a citizen with his identification.
What are you talking about? Voter ID, which would of necessity have to be a federal form of ID?
Voter ID, you say? Voter ID?
And once you have that, it's very easy for you to use that same federal ID for the healthcare programs too.
Is it just federal identification?
I don't know. Are you talking about the emotional and cultural identification as Americans? You know, we all bleed red.
Well, you see, the thing is, they're talking about how starting this first of the year, everybody's going to have some sort of ID to get on board a plane. They're going to have a federal ID for that. They're talking about it being a passport, which is expensive and takes a long time to get. But it doesn't have to be a passport, does it?
No, and there's been talk about a federal ID for years and years and years now. Now, once upon a time, I was very concerned about that because it puts an enormous amount of power into the hands of the federal government. You have all these databases, but it seems like the days where you could avoid it are have passed.
Mm, yes. Most people don't realize it, but for all males in this society, once you hit the age of 18, you have to have a federal ID anyway.
In the form
It's
of
called a
Social
draft
Security.
card.
Yeah.
No, it's called a draft card. Social Security card you get when you're a babe in the hospital nowadays.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got my Social Security number at the same time that I had to register for selective service. So I guess
That's because you're of a certain age.
I'm old. Happens to everyone. All you
Yes,
laughing
it does,
youngsters,
doesn't
it will be coming for you as well.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, it will. But you see, the thing is that no matter how we slice it up, we still come around to Trump is trying to bring capitalism to America. And capitalism requires a few things: that you have a job, that you have some capital to begin with, and some identification. You see, in today's market, you must have identification. Otherwise, you don't have capital.
Well, it's just like look at the early forms of counters for money. As you know, I spent a good bit of time studying this. A lot of people have said that, what's most important is, in the emergence of cuneiform is that you originally had these tokens. It was Denise Schmandt-Besserat out of Texas who had the token hypothesis that the earliest forms of writing came out of tokens. And she talked about this thing called the Nutsi bulla, which is basically it was an archaeological find. What they used to do once upon a time is they would put together a bunch of tokens representing the shit a person owned. So it could be little figurines of 6 sheep, right? Let's just say that. And then you wrap those 6 sheep in a clay bulla, which is you basically pack the clay around them to make a sphere. And then you mark the outside of it with the seal. And this one I'm recalling, it's Zikaru the shepherd, right? That seal. And see, the bulla becomes like an envelope with a piece of paper listing what you own, except it's little figurines wrapped and then sealed by clay. You cannot have the financial transactions at a distance or the records of them or anything else without the tokens representing what you own, but more importantly, without the seal upon it indicating that they are yours. And so I guess what I'm coming around to is that your point about the identification for each person means that you can now pin them down, engage in contracts with them. You have a signature that goes with it. I often think that what we're going to see, a lot of people don't know this, but in East Asia, they don't have a signature as we do. They don't sign it at the bottom. What they have is a seal that they physically have to keep possession of. If someone else gets a hold of their little seal...
Used to be called chop, did it not? Yes.
Well, if you lose it, someone can sign for you because it's the seal that matters. You must maintain possession of it. And I believe that we're going to be seeing essentially what is a digital version of the East Asian system that will shortly be used to indicate one's acquiescence or participation or agreement to a contract in the way that a signature does today. Because first off, you see the way I've dealt with mortgage applications recently where you're like, they send you the digital version and you have a little fake signature you do online, but it's your digital signature. It's really half-assed. I think that's going to be another feature, but that's neither here nor there.
But you see, the thing is that you've got to remember that capitalism requires that the capitalist view his capital as a farmer views his dairy cows.
Right. You don't cut them all up for meat. You destroy your wealth. You have to keep breeding them. You have to keep producing milk. You want them to be in a good mood and doing well, and you'll only very rarely come through and get one of the old, tough, scrawny ones and butcher it.
Well, we have Social Security instead of that. You see, we're in the process of trying to convert what these people think is capitalism into real capitalism. Now, it's been tried many times, but usually with a socialist flavor.
But now here's an interesting thing, if I may jump in, because this immediately comes to mind. The raising of herds and cattle is very much an Indo-European thing. And
Really?
as we just discussed, cattle, chattel, capital, and the way in which these words go back to this central root and the idea is that one is a herdsman. I mean, you just went
Mm-hmm.
straight to that metaphor, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And yet, collectivist, so going back to take a good Indo-European example to finish this side of things first, I went through and I'm not finished with it yet, but I've got a copy of the Iliad where I'm going through and I'm identifying every single occurrence of a cattle or sheep, a livestock herding metaphor, and they're everywhere. Menelaus calls out and the ranks of soldiers line up like sheep that have been organized. It's a fundamental metaphor for understanding how you do things and for capitalism itself. So that's one side. It's very Indo-European, and it goes with our ancient culture and its various tendrils that wind up in different ways. And yet, as I started to say, you've got the management of herds as the central metaphor for socialism as well. And so you can take a look at things like Christianity, which seems to be the first appearance of social justice in the West. And the idea you've got the flock and the herd, the good shepherd, right? And you find similar kind of metaphors in Islamic doctrine expressed in their writings. So I wonder if there's a great opportunity here for me to file an image in my mind to distinguish between how a socialist deals with a herd and how a capitalist deals with a herd. I mean, you see it also. It's such a fundamental metaphor. It goes with all human beings. Like the Ottomans referred to the different ethnic groups within their imperial structure as raya, which means a flock. So this metaphor is widespread everywhere, but there must be some difference that we could identify in how one group deals with a herd and how another one does that maybe will shed light on the distinction here.
Well, look at how communists and socialists deal with herds. They aren't theirs. They belong to the people. They belong to anybody but me.
Right, but then you get like a herdsman out west and, welcome to the Bar T Ranch. Everything here is marked. The barn is marked with my shit. The equipment of for the cowboys that I give to them if they don't buy their own is marked with, the Bar T. The fences are marked with the Bar T. The Bar T is down there in the cattle register of brands that's held by, the municipality or the county
Sure.
And it goes all the way back to...
He cares about every calf out of every cow that comes out, does he not? Whereas the communist or socialist sees nothing wrong with accepting a certain number of them dying. And more of them can die if the people demand it. Does this not show you something?
But is there a parallel in how some people treat raising of cattle? If we keep it strictly out of the political realm, are there two different ways of raising herd animals that underline this distinction I'm trying to tease forth?
Well, now you've got to decide whether you're going to talk about beef cattle or you're going to talk about dairy cattle. Beef cattle, you cull the herd every now and again. You start taking off the steers with 2 years. Whereas with beef cattle, with dairy cattle, all you've got is a bunch of cows. You ain't got no steers. All you got is a bunch of cows. You raise them till they milk out, which is about 7-8 years. And once they're milked out, you start reaching that point of diminishing returns. Well, so you get rid of her.
It sounds like there's some ways you can see aspects on either side of these two approaches, but I'm not seeing a clear cut one. I don't want to use up too much of our time on it because we have about 10 minutes left, but I'm going to stick a pin in this and give it some thought because it strikes me that it could end up being a really quick and easy metaphorical way to describe in a fashion that everybody can understand the difference between these approaches.
Well, let's look at it like this. No matter how you do it, you still got cattle, you still got people, you still got ownership of them, and you still got basically a bunch of people who want something from you and are willing to give something to you for it. And in capitalism, you reach a trade. In socialism, you do not.
Stand and
in
deliver.
communism, you do not. Yes. Well, stand and deliver, sure. Because what you have belongs to the people. And the people need it of you now.
Never mind that I can't show you the people, but I'm their representative.
Ah, there you are. The whole thing is that Trump is trying to show these people how they can be people, remain people, and engage in capitalism, which is why I am looking forward to seeing entry-level positions in capitalism set up. This is why small business ownership is so important. This is why doing away with the regulations and the other nonsense that restrains capitalism.
Right, like requiring some sort of degree in order to practice something, or requiring degrees to get into these more recognizably capitalist levels of employment. And I've seen quite a bit now appearing in the news about how there are a number of people who are now like, no experience required, just show up and prove, that you're able to do the job, which is the classical capitalist system.
Indeed it is. Now, the regulations and rules that govern starting a small business have been being cut.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure that this comes across crystal clear. This points out that they must attack the degree system and the universities and the debt it creates as a part of this overall picture. We can table that for discussion later, but it's going to be a big part of this.
Yes, it will. You see why I was in no hurry to get on with this.
There's quite a bit to cover, yes.
There is. Now, the real thing with communism is that you must touch base with everybody in your chain of command, because there's a definite chain of command. Whereas with capitalism, there isn't a chain of command, not a real live one. If somebody comes up with a good idea, you go, hey, that guy's got a good idea. Let's try that.
Or even look at it legally. It occurs to me, it's very, very interesting. You and I sign a contract, and the state has not a fucking thing to do with it. It doesn't have to be registered with the state. You don't have to deposit a copy with the clerk of the court. You have now, if it comes to the point where there must be some kind of litigation or, to fight it out in court, at that point you bring it over and it gets discussed. But otherwise it's between two individuals, and the state only emerges when it becomes necessary to enforce the contract.
A contract is anything that two people or more agree to that is legal, for which a thing of value changes hands. That's contract.
And that's kind of like capitalism, summarized.
My God, Ollie, you don't mean that. Oh, my God. And that's the foundation of our entire system. But it's the foundation that nobody really likes. When they get into government, they want to regulate everything in sight. Touch a county commissioner. The first thing you find is regulations, rules. Why?
Because they want power over it.
Oh, I see. So capitalism presupposes that government doesn't have a lot of power? I'll have to think about that some, Ollie. It's an interesting idea. Well,
then how would you summarize, other than through abusing me? How would you?
It's so much fun to abuse. I'm sorry. Do go ahead.
How would you summarize? In 5 minutes or less. We came from communists among us, commies under the bed. Talking about it in the United States in the first clip. Of course, we couldn't cover everything. Both of these clips have ultimately become just starters for further thought, and I guess I'm happy enough that that's so. It's better than watching stultifying babbling. And so I hope our viewers will be pleased enough that the ideas have been kicked around a bit, and a few candles in the darkness have been lit. But how would you summarize, both communism in the US and this communism abroad that we sort of tapped on? What would you leave us with to consider? What future vision should we bear in mind? What things should we be aware of or look out for? How would you summarize all of this?
That communism is going to fall. It's going to fall completely, totally, and of its own weight. It's going to fall. The Chinese have bitten off more than they can chew in Africa, and with this one belt, one road thing. The Russians are biting off more than they can chew in Syria, Turkey, and Iran, because the Iranians are about to come apart at the seams. And all that's going to be left is going to be capitalism. Good old-fashioned capitalism. Anytime you get a closed system where the communists have to rely upon their own series of events to make things happen, you wind up with a Cuba or a Venezuela. It's real simple, Ollie. Anytime you got capitalists who get to rely upon their own systems as capital systems, you wind up with shit taken off like a rocket. So I see communism going through a horrible, lingering death brought about by the Chinese involvement with all this stuff in Africa and all of this involvement of the petro yuan. All right, fine. Stave it off as long as you like. The yuan is only as good as it's thought to be. It's going to fall. Mr. Soros and all of his minions and myrmidons is going to die very shortly. And when he does die, I predict that his sons are going to pull their horns back in and become capitalists, not socialists. I predict that anybody who stays socialist and continues to march around with the socialist internationale being sung and hymned at them is going to be like those lovely little children in Antifa, skinny-legged, living in somebody's basement on somebody else's nickel, because they're not really going to have a damn thing. I predict that socialism is going to fall because it's going to be countervailed with a form of capitalism these people have not yet begun to appreciate. But I think that Uncle Trump is about to show them some of this capitalism. And I just feel like Jeff Sessions here. I just feel like, my goodness, what we have here is a basic failure to communicate.